Hello, everybody. Welcome to our fourth lecture. This week, we want to talk about some topics that our textbook talks about. And two of the chapters that you have read or will be reading involve plagiarism and avoiding biased language. So let's talk about plagiarism. Plagiarism has been around since humans have been around. I remember years ago when my son was in fifth or sixth grade, and I was talking to him one day. He was at the computer, and I said to him, "Well, what are you doing?" He says, "I'm writing a paper." So I said, "I'd like to read it when you're done." So he printed it out and brought it to me, and I said, "Brandon, this isn't a paper. This is cheating." And he said, "What, Dad?" And I said, "You're not allowed to just go to website after website and just cut and block and put it in your paper and string those together. That's called cheating. Which websites did you use?" And he said, "Oh, Dad, that's how papers are written nowadays." And I said, "No, I'm a teacher. I know." And he goes, "No, Dad, I promise you, this is how papers are written nowadays." Well, uh, he had to learn the hard way that stealing other people's work isn't plagiarism. And this PowerPoint that I'm using is adapted from Maureen Merca, and so I'm going to give her full credit. So avoiding plagiarism, well, we have to talk through some questions here involving what plagiarism is. So plagiarism basically is using someone else's work without giving them credit and implying or saying that it is your own. So plagiarism is just a kind of stealing. Now, if we step back, none of us, and especially me, came up with anything originally. And so as we learn, as we study, as information gets in our brain, clearly, as I talk or as I give a lecture or as I am talking to someone, the stuff in my brain isn't original to me. I didn't think this up. And that situation, clearly, I'm not going to, as I'm giving a lecture, constantly refer back to where I read it because I don't even know where I read it. So plagiarism is really an intentional attempt to swipe someone's work. But we do have to talk, and we will talk about unintentional plagiarism because I think that there's quite a lot of that goes around. If you want NIAC's definition from the syllabus and catalog, you can just go to your syllabus for this course and go to the catalog, and NIAC's definition is there. Among the things that surprise students is one of the things that's considered plagiarism is submitting a paper in one class that you already submitted in another class. That's considered cheating. So be careful. You should probably go back and read that to make sure that you don't ever find yourself in a situation where you're plagiarizing. So clearly, some examples of plagiarism: copying from online text, journals, encyclopedias, papers, copying and pasting any text from web sources, using photographs, audio, video without permission or acknowledgement, using another student's paper or your older brother or sister's paper, your parents' work, claiming it as your own, even if you had permission. You're still representing the work as your own and not as someone else's. And believe it or not, this is surprising to some people, you can actually engage in self-plagiarism. Now, once or twice students have told me that they have been told that they were plagiarizing from a previous paper that they wrote. And well, I'm not going to get all worked up about that. If you are in a situation where you've written a paper, let's say on depression for one class, and you're writing another paper for another class, and you refer back to your first paper, you should cite yourself. You should put your paper in the references, and in the in-text citations, you should cite yourself. That's keeping it as legal as possible. Here's where sometimes plagiarism gets unintentional. Quoting from a source without using quotation marks, even if you cite it. So if you take a direct quote from a journal article, and when you put it in your paper, there are not quote marks around it with not only the citation but the page number, that is considered plagiarism, because a direct quote says that you're exactly using the words from that source. Whereas if you just use those words and don't put quote marks around them, you're implying that while you got the information from that source, you're not using the original author's exact words. You also should never cite sources that you actually didn't use. Some students are notorious for this. In order to pad their reference page, they'll put 10 or 15 journal articles that they didn't actually read, they didn't actually use, just to make their reference page look impressive. Do not do that. And in fact, I would say to you, in a literature review paper, every source in your references should be cited somewhere in your the body of your paper with an in-text citation. Clearly, this is just another variation on the theme. We are blessed with the internet, and clearly it's easy just to go block information from the internet and pretend that it's yours in a paper. That's cheating. There are ways to cite websites, and you'll be able to find that out as we go through the semester. And as we already said, NIAC's policy prevents you from turning in one paper for one class and pretending that you didn't use it for another class. And I'm sure you could think of more examples. Ask yourself this: is there any way in which this information which I'm using, I'm pretending to be my own? Now, avoiding plagiarism is pretty much straightforward. Whenever possible, you want to use your own words and ideas. Now, as we'll see later in the semester, there are times when we summarize the argument or the results from a journal article, and that's not plagiarism. We're not using the exact words, but we give a citation. And I would say this, that whenever you are in doubt about whether an idea, something in the article is not yours, I would encourage you to cite. It's hard to get in trouble for oversighting. It's quite easy to get in trouble for underciting. You want to give credit to the source where you got your information, and it's better to do that more than less. And clearly, whenever there is a direct quote, you can't just change one or two words in a sentence or two and say that that's not a direct quote. That is plagiarism. It's much better to use quote marks and to use an in-text citation, include the source, include the page number. Again, the operational rule here is whenever in doubt, create a citation. Now, when you paraphrase someone's work, and you're not quoting them directly, you're summarizing or you're rearranging the sentence, or you're trying to put the idea without the direct words. Again, essentially what you need to do is give credit. If, for instance, I was quoting Freud from 1920, page 19, I would put Freud, 1920, P dot period space 19. If I've summarized the argument that Freud makes on page 19 without directly quoting it, what I want to do is just put, after my summarization, put Freud, 1920. So you always want to give credit. One way to avoid inadvertent plagiarism is when you're reading a source to take notes and force yourself. This is a very good thing to do when you're writing, is to force yourself to summarize what you're reading while you take your notes. In other words, don't just write direct quotes down. Ask yourself as you're reading. You're going to save yourself a lot of time when you sit down to write the paper, but take very good notes. And in the note-taking process, avoid direct quotes. I'm not a person that likes any direct quotes in a lit review paper. There are times, and we'll get to that later in the semester, when it's appropriate. But a good way to do this is to summarize as you go, using your own words to write it down. And then clearly on your note card or on your piece of paper, you can put Freud 1920, or you can put, Skinner 1963. This way you don't have to go back and look at the original source. It's a challenge, particularly when we're trying to summarize information that we're not quite sure of. And in that particular situation, you should probably try and understand what you're reading before you begin summarizing. And that may mean that you have to get out a dictionary or even a psych dictionary. There's plenty of ones online. If there's words there that you're unfamiliar with, look them up in a psychology dictionary. Just go to Google and type in psychology dictionary, look up the word. Because the more you can understand what you're reading, the less likely you are to want to directly quote, or if you're not directly quoting, summarize using that person's words and not giving adequate citation. So avoid cosmetic changes, changing one or two words or three words. Ask yourself, if you were explaining this, how would you explain it to someone that has no background? And that summary is usually a direct and clear one. And again, to remind you earlier, APA style wants us to be clear, succinct, and direct. I hope you've enjoyed this and found it helpful. You can go on to the next lecture. I'll see you in that lecture.